Hello, hello. So actually, in truth, I'm sort of using you guys. What happened, last year I did a lot of public speaking, and then around October I just realized I can't stand it. I needed to just retract and be at home with my family and all that. So I've spent a few happy months just kind of being more private, and then I get sort of insular and weird, like a sort of Berkeley weirdo, you know. But in a couple of weeks, I have the paperback's launching, and I have to go to New York. And my first scheduled public thing was going to be on Colbert and then on Charlie Rose and stuff. And I'm realizing, oh, geez, you know, I'm totally out of practice coming out of my cocoon and talking to people. So I just wanted to do like one thing before I go full bore and like all this stuff. So I'm using you to kind of try to break out of the cocoon and remember how to be with the real world out there again. So you're the real world, such as it is. And I'm wondering if this is really a good calculation on my part. But anyway. Yeah, I know. Hey there, how you doing? Oh, gosh. So, all right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about my last book called Who Owns the Future, and some of the ongoing work related to it, some of the controversy that surrounded it. So has anybody here read it, out of curiosity? Oh, so few people. So I wrote some new chapters for the paperback that are about more recent research and events that have happened. So if those of you who've read it, unless you would prefer to never have any more contact with it, might enjoy seeing the new stuff too. Let us begin. About 35 years ago, I was a teenager, and I had the good fortune to be able to link up with some of the top computer science minds in that era and get into the game pretty early. And there was this idea back then that started to take hold in people my age mostly. And it was this notion that if you look at the course of human history, you see one pattern over and over and over again, which is that people struggle for power over each other. And those who gain power are often quite cruel and needlessly so. And furthermore, the method by which power is retained usually includes controlling communication and information. And then you combine that with a very interesting realization that you can't make digital networks work at all unless they correct for blockages of communication. A packet switch network routes around blocks and that sort of thing. You put those two together and you think, wow, you know, digital networks might have something to do with improving this horrible pattern of human social behavior that's existed throughout history. The particular example that always got me was the banning of drumming among slaves in the United States, where you think like how like just the astonishing petty perversity of banning drumming because of the theory that maybe it could be used to communicate codes that would have something to do with planning rebellions. But if the drums had been packets in a packet switch networks, they wouldn't have been bannable because they would have routed around the plantations, right? So speaking roughly. So there's this idealistic notion that an open digital network might just be able to be a kind of a remedy. And that idea has found expression in a lot of different forms, but almost all of those forms appeared initially and were articulated initially in a rather small social circle in the early 80s. Some of the examples were the open source movement, which was pretty much started by Richard Stallman, who was a crazy friend of mine where it had more crazy entanglements than you'd believe. And there were other versions of it. The sort of fetish that hackers have with encryption was another aspect of that. That if we can combine encryption with an open network, then we have this ability to be immune to the powers that be. Although at that time we didn't know the NSA existed yet. I don't know if it did actually, but so anyway, there was this whole thing. I was very much part of it. I helped articulate it. Since I'm also a musician, as Ken mentioned, I particularly helped articulate this idea that if you just let the music business become open instead of copyright driven. If you just shared your music for free, that would ultimately be better for people. The whole system would reformat itself in a way that would ultimately turn out to be better for people. That's still a very dominant idea, of course. That's still considered, I think, on the cutting edge of coolness or something all these years later, which astonishes me. Around the turn of the century, I started to really feel that the idea wasn't working. And this is one of those moments where there's a conflict between one's abstract ideals and then empirical results. They didn't agree with each other. So the abstract ideal was that openness should turn around and help everybody. The reality I was seeing is that it was helping some people sort of infinitely and then hurting other people, and there wasn't a lot in between. It was turning the human affairs into a zip curve or a power law or long tail, whatever term you prefer. On the people who were benefiting were in many cases people I had directly helped. I had been a consultant helping set up some of the early high-frequency trading concerns, some of the early elaborate financial concerns. I consulted to Amazon, Fannie Mae, I'm trying to think of all these crazy places, way back, like in the 90s. And no, Amazon would be later. But at any rate, the thing is, the people who ended up in control of the hub computers in an open network didn't just benefit. They got the fastest and biggest fortunes and concentrations of power in history. I mean, it just was astonishing, the transformation that took place. Earlier in the 80s, when you went to a meeting like the Davos meeting in Switzerland or something, the rich, powerful people either were sheikhs who controlled oil fields, or they might be Greeks who controlled shipping lines. It was all transportation and physical materials. By the turn of the century, there was this transformation where the most wealthy people were the people who controlled a digital hub, the people who were just routing those packets with the biggest computer. And that was a really strange transformation. So those people were not just doing well, but they were kind of doing too well. And I was part of that wave. I've done well in that world, so I'm not complaining personally at all. I've been on the good side of it. But what really bothered me is I was absolutely convinced earlier that open culture and open digital systems and a rejection of the boundaries imposed by systems like copyright would be good for musicians, for journalists, for photographers, for people like that. And I can still state the old theory. I can still state the old rhetoric, because I did make some of it up. I really know it. And yet, when I looked at the results in the real world, it just didn't agree. I started to see, once again, a sort of a perverse situation where real world, not hypothetical imaginary musicians or journalists, but real world journalists and musicians and photographers were being sorted into a zip curve or a winner-takes-all curve, where before they'd had a strong middle class. So it's not that there were no winners at all, but it's just that there was a sharp cutoff between a very small number of winners and then a vast sea of losers. And that is not what it was like before. If you look at the data for musicians around the turn of the century, it's really astonishing how large a middle class there was of musicians. But according to data from the Internal Revenue Service, there were, I think, here I'm doing this from memory, so I might have this slightly wrong, but I think there were 300,000 musicians making over $100,000 a year that they reported. And if you know musicians the way I know them, you know that that's underreported, if anything. And so that's like a big middle class, a big, good, strong middle class. And the vast majority of those, by far, were not famous, were not stars, but they were people who worked in orchestra pits or recording studios. That whole world went away. It was replaced by a phantasm. There's still, you can read mainstream news articles that still report that there's this huge class of people who are doing really well in the sharing economy. And yet, whenever you try to actually find them and count them, they disappear. Now, I haven't done that for the most recent versions of the sharing economy, so I don't know exactly what's going on with the people who drive for Uber or the people who rent out their places to Airbnb or whatever. However, what I found for musicians is that people in the idealist Silicon Valley world just assumed there were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of musicians doing great by promoting themselves for free over our networks. I did everything I could to find them. I asked for people to point them out to me one by one. I tried to go to sites where they congregate. There are a certain number of fake ones you can find, which are people with trust funds who pretend they're making it. But in terms of people who were plausibly real, they exist, but just handfuls. I mean, they're incredibly tiny numbers. For instance, I recently, last year, I did an inventory of the hip-hop world globally, working with a lot of top hip-hop artists trying to just gather these people. Who are the people who've promoted themselves online and are now actually making a living? And we came up with a number of about 50. So I celebrate those people. That's great. If Amanda Palmer can raise money for a tour on Kickstarter, that's great. But if you actually count the numbers, we're talking about handfuls of people. Like, it's just crazy. Given the social sort of illusion that there are whole classes of people who are rising up, we've moved from hundreds of thousands to dozens. Now, we might be at the beginning of some S-curve. Maybe there'll be hundreds of thousands in 10 years. That would be great. However, it's been stagnant now. We're more than a decade and a half into the switch, and I haven't seen it budge. It's really, really stagnant. Now, on top of this, is a sort of I would say a confusion about what wealth is that's been brought about. So there are people who are saying, well, if I can lower my costs through the digital sharing economy, and I can get cheaper rides through a ride-sharing service, and I can get cheaper places to crash through a living place sharing service, and blah, 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 why do I need to make as much money anyway? But the problem with this is that it's thrusting almost everybody into what we call an informal economy, where you don't build up wealth, and then concentrating all the wealth with the people who run the networks that facilitate the sharing economy. Now, the problem with an informal economy is that it doesn't have any, the engineering term is hysteresis. Anybody know that term? It's internal staying power or momentum. So the idea behind wealth is that you don't have to sing for your supper for every meal. If you're wealthy, you can afford to get sick or stay home with a sick child. You can afford to get old. You can afford to have a relative in need and take care of them for a while. It gives you the latitude to not have to sing for your supper for every meal, and that makes every difference in the world, because the reality of people and the reality of biology is that we're not superheroes who are young forever and will live forever, but we're these fragile people who suffer all kinds of life contingencies. And reality is kind of random. And that's the difference between wealth and bargains. And so the reason why in the developing world billions of people are hoping to get out of the informal economy and into a formal economy is to get that benefit. And yet somehow, because of the sexiness of the new, generations of young people who've grown up with the rhetoric I'm afraid I helped invent have gotten this crazy idea that the informal economy is the cool economy. There's some people who think that the informal economy is that the informal economy is some sort of a passageway to a kind of a more socialist or communitarian solution. And I have to remind them about all that power and wealth being concentrated. And that's where that fails. If this were only the sharing economy and there wasn't this incredible concentration of super wealthy people facilitating it, that might be a scenario, but it's precisely not what's happening. What's happening is we're creating a new super elite, of whom I'm a pseudo-member, I guess. I'm a marginal member of it, but I have a lot of friends who are definitely members of it. And they're nice people. I do think one of the things that's very hopeful about this time is that we have the nicest, best intended, most pleasant, most charitable super elite in history, I think. And now, of course, that doesn't do any good if nobody acts. If that, it could be a lost potential, but there's extraordinary potential there. We're not dealing with creeps for the most part. There are creeps in the Silicon Valley elite. There are more of them in the global financial elite. But, mostly they're kind of cool kids. They're the kinds of kids who graduate at the top of their class in math or computer science from here. Those are the people who end up going and building these things. So, given that, it's absolutely worth talking about these ideas on the level. I think it's not appropriate to create an us and them situation of enmity towards the people who've been the big winners in this system, because none of us saw it coming. I was totally surprised by how it turned out. Nobody understood what was happening. I assure you, I was there. There was not an evil plan. We were naive. In a way, it was it was a worthy experiment. It was an honorable, worthy experiment. It might have worked. It just turned out it didn't. Just like in science experiment, hypotheses sometimes are proven wrong, and I think that's what happened in this case. It was honorable. The only dishonor would come is if we ignore the results so far. And, it's very hard. It's incredibly challenging to the human psyche to overcome illusions that happen to benefit you tremendously, even if they hurt other people. It's a gigantic spiritual leap, I think is the right term for it. So don't expect some sort of instant transformation. So what I want to do now is go into a bit more detail about the patterns that have emerged and how it turns out that informations really work on a large scale. The first thing to understand is a little bit of very basic, a bit of basic wisdom about the limits of statistics, actually. So what big computing can do is gather big data and perform operations on it, which are statistical. So understanding exactly what statistics is and what it isn't is absolutely crucial to understanding big data and big networks. There's been a tendency in the big computer world, the big network world, to want to equate statistical correlations with absolute wisdom. This comes up a whole lot. I can give you so many examples of it. I'll just give you a couple. One of them is my friend and neighbor Chris Anderson's idea. He was the editor-in-chief of Wired for a long time. Now he sells drones instead. But he published a famous paper called The End of Theory. And I think there was another version of it called The End of Science. But the basic idea was that if you have enough big data and you can plot future events, why do you need scientists coming up with theories for prediction? Because big data replaces that. Now, here's the thing about it. If we lived in an entirely different universe in which there wasn't structure, but just a continuity of possibilities, then that would be true. So if I was moving my hand this way and when it hit the lectern it just continued to interpenetrate it, that would be a different kind of universe than the one we live in. We live in a universe that's governed by conservation principles and exclusion principles, and they're quite fundamental so far as we can tell, and they result in structure so that my hand cannot interpenetrate the lectern. Now, the reason I'm making such a fuss about that is that if you gather statistical data about my hand's motion and some algorithm in somebody's remote computer is plotting it, it'll predict that it'll just pass through, right? And so what happened, but the interesting thing about it is that it's almost always the case that a statistical plot forward will be correct for some period of time. So there's a very interesting kind of, you could call it a teasing effect that happens with big data and big computers, where there's always initial positive feedback that you've become God and are omniscient, and then there's a sudden crash or failure of that. But during that gap, when you feel as though you're omniscient and have a perfect understanding of reality, it's awfully hard to hear arguments that it might not be true. So, I mean, there's so many examples of this, I hardly know where to start. The world of finance provides, in a way, the most delicious examples. One I remember very clearly because I knew some of the principles, was in the 90s an outfit called LongTerm Capital Management. Now, Since this is an audience of, if I may say so, an audience of people of many of you will remember what this is. When I speak to groups of undergraduates, they often have never heard of it, and I always tell them you should learn about it because you'll be paying for it your whole life. So you might as well know what it is. But of course, what it was one of the early attempts to make a perfect financial machine out of a big computer. So what this thing did is it gathered a bunch of data, it plotted forward, it seemed to be perfect. It seemed to be the absolute ultimate money machine. And because of this mistaken idea about how science works and how reality works, because of this mistaken epistemology, there was this idea that a perfect money machine would also be absolutely perfectly and without question adding order and reducing risk in the overall marketplace, so it must be win-win for everybody. But of course, what actually happened is it concentrated a huge ton of wealth while it was working, and then it hit a structural flaw, and it crashed so big that it required an enormous bailout, which is the thing we're all paying for. Now, I was around. I knew some of the people, and I am convinced that long-term capital management was innocent, very much like our early ideas. I think it's a confusing area, and it was very new at the time. And it would have been plausible and honorable to think that this crazy idea could work. Because sometimes crazy ideas turn out to be true. I mean, look at quantum field theory works. I mean, it's just insane. So given that some really crazy, unlikely stuff has turned out to work, why not this? So it wasn't, I think we have to limit our condemnation of the first people on the scene who might have been confused. However, then came Enron. Now, likewise, I tell undergraduates, you're going to be paying for Enron. You should know about it. Enron, at this point, was not innocent. That was a deliberate scam, using some of the same techniques. And once again, it used statistical correlations to accumulate wealth. They'd hoped to get out of it and wash their hands before it crashed, but they didn't quite. Those people were nasty. I had interactions with them as well. So that was a real fake. Then it happened again with the mortgage-backed securities. Very similar thing, but on a much larger scale. And I could go into some of the degrees of difference between these events. I mean, long-term security was gathering purely numeric data from markets. Enron was starting to look at natural language data as well, very much in the way that Google scrapes the web all the time for search. They were trying to scrape the world for signals that might influence their decisions automatically, and so forth. When we get to the mortgage-backed security era, instead of just one player, you have a class of players who are more coordinated, I think, than we sometimes realize. They were still small, but they were multiple players spread out over continents. Anyway, the same mistake over and over again. So there's an initial period of false verification of your omniscience where statistics is perfect because it hasn't encountered structure yet. And then you hit structure, and then there's a massive failure. So in my view, this is an inevitable mode of failure if you're going to believe in statistics over structure. Now, the problem is we don't know how to represent structure in all cases. Now, there's some cases where we can. Now real science is actually hard to do. And I try to make a distinction between two kinds of big data. Big data used by scientists is a very different thing than big data used by business. Big data used by scientists is still evolving. We haven't really formalized what scientific method looks like for big data. We haven't really agreed on a standard set of analogs to the tradition of peer review and publication and replication, all these things. We have ad hoc approximations of them that vary from time to time. So we have a long way to go, but at least it's real science, and everyone understands how hard it is. A great example is genomics, or stem cell research. Any of these things where you gather enormous amounts of data, you do very broad experiments in parallel, and you make slow progress. There's not a magic bullet. One of the characteristics about big data is it's less amenable to sudden analytic breakthroughs. If you go back into the history of science over the last few centuries, there were these moments when a smart person sitting somewhere suddenly has this aha breakthrough, and they come up with a simple, elegant, analytic description of events, which then can be tested and proves to be true. And they make this huge leap. And this is the image we have of, I don't know, an Einstein or a Newton or somebody like that. Big data is not like that. Big data is this massive, slow, collaborative, empirical, incremental process. All evidence points to it being absolutely as significant as the traditional leaps of analytic thinking, and yet we have to get used to its character. And it's a little hard because we're all impatient little children who want instant treats. But big data doesn't give you that. However, it does give you the illusion of that, which is where the trickery comes in, and I think that's how we've all fallen into this trouble. So, what happens with big business, big data? Well, it's a funny thing. The first company to really delve into it, I think, was Walmart, which is something that's not often recognized. But back in the 80s was the first time people started to understand you could use big computers and networks to calculate an advantage over everybody with statistics. That was kind of when the revelation happened. And it's been kind of Moore's Law driven. It depends how expensive the computers and networks are. And in the 80s, that expense was still a lot, but it was already getting to be plausible to use it for business advantage. So in 87, we saw the first flash crash from automated trading, for instance. And that's when Amazon started to get this idea, well, you know, if we gather a bunch of data, we can use it to make better decisions than our competitors and just win based on data omniscience. It's an amazing idea. And at the time, it's hard to realize now, it was a pretty avant-garde idea. I mean, I remember when I consulted for them, and they were like sort of weird visionary people, actually. You know, so it worked. The thing they optimized was not their consumer marketplace, but their supply chain. So what they did is they gathered data about every little link in the chain of how a product is moved by truck from here to here, where it's manufactured, where the raw materials come from. They tried to build a model of everything that happens that results in a product getting in the store. And then whenever they went to negotiate with a supplier or somebody doing transportation, any kind of value in the link, they were able to estimate what their bottom line would be. And they were so good at it that they were able to negotiate people right down to the bottom. And so what it did is it basically forced out their competition because nobody else could figure out what they were doing. Everybody else ended up with worse margins and higher prices in their stores. Now, once again, this was one of the first times it happened, and I think it would be wrong to condemn these people because nobody could understand the implications of such a huge experiment. I think there were a lot of good results of it. I think despite all of our complaints about labor in China and so forth, at that time, those who were around will remember that in the 70s and 80s, there was an ambient terror that the rise of China might be a very violent one. It might be a very confrontational one. During the rapid industrialization of China, there have been many years when Walmart by itself has been responsible for, I think, like 15% of Chinese exports. It's just an insanely high number. So what happened was this optimization of the supply chain smoothed the path for this giant power to enter into a cooperative economy in the world. And it might have spared us a world war. You know, it's not an implausible claim. So I don't want to, I'm not trying to give a simplistic condemnation where all uses of big data have turned out terribly. That would be quite a mistake. But at the same time, the criticisms leveled at Walmart, I think, are quite accurate, that it's impoverished its own customer base to the point where its own future is limited. And that's got to be stupid in the big picture. But it's painted itself into a corner now. What can it do? So anyway, that was the first attempt. The next big milestone in applying big data to ordinary people was from Sergey Brin at Google. So I don't know if the story's true. I never really asked him, but he's great. I should say once again, here's a person who I think is really an admirable, decent, good guy. There's no reason to condemn these people at all. In fact, they deserve a lot of admiration. But at any rate, Sergey claims that when he was a Stanford student, he came up with this to impress a girl on a date, because I guess Stanford women want to know your business plan or something. So So you say, okay, we'll do search, but we're not going to charge for it because that would be overhead and complicated. Let's just do advertising. Now, here's what the problem is with that. Once again, entered into innocently. But the broad implication of using advertising as the model for computational business is profoundly dysfunctional. The first thing is to understand that the term advertising has come to mean something entirely different than it used to mean. Advertising used to be a form of persuasion. It used to be a somewhat romantic, sometimes annoying, cloying form of persuasion, but that's what it was. I've worked in the ad business, weirdly enough. I did jingles, the music for ads, so I've been on the other side of that one too. And there's plenty of reasons to be annoyed with ads. There's plenty of reasons to think that advertising has made the pharmaceutical industry insane, for instance, where it spends more on ads than on research and all that. So, but maybe there's an argument, and I think it's a legitimate argument, that advertising has helped smooth the path to modernization in many cases, since people are so habit-bound. And that's a good thing. The modern world has been progressively kinder than the past. You have to understand how bad the past was to appreciate modernity, and many people don't. But at any rate, whatever you think of traditional advertising, the new thing is not that. Instead, it's link placement. Now, there's a critical concept, which is the cost of choice. So nobody reads through the first 3 million web results on a search, right? Because it would take you too much time. You can go through a page, maybe a couple pages, but nobody goes that far. And so the truth is that because the number of possibilities available over a network is so large, the easiest ones become vastly more likely as destinations than the farther ones. So when there's paid-for options put in front of you that are easy, it effectively becomes micromanagement of human behavior. Now, this is a subtle thing, because there's two different perspectives here. And once again, this has to do with understanding statistics. On one level, you can say, hey, nobody forced you to follow this link or that. Nobody forced you to do this or that. You're free. It's your responsibility. And that's true as far as it goes. However, broadly, statistically, it's just true that people have a finite amount of attention, a finite amount of energy, a finite amount of just what they can deal with on many levels. And so statistically, you do micromanage a population that way. And so it fundamentally corrupts the information system, because it means, like if you're saying, well, our search engine is pure of heart, but then on the side are the paid-for links. Well, the thing is, they're right there. It corrupts the whole process. So what it does is it allows third parties to pay for micromanagement of what you do. Now, once again, you can say, oh, well, it's just links on the side of a page. Just ignore them. Who cares? Hey, could somebody try to close that door? Oh, I appreciate it so much. But then again, as technology becomes more and more intimate, as we start entering the world of wearables and implants and all of this, and we will, just because of human fragility, we're all going to choose to use medical implants that'll really help us. As that data starts getting gathered and you start getting paid options put in front of you, it really starts to erode personal privacy and then personal identity and free will. And this is a concept that I sometimes have trouble getting across, because we're so used to the metaphor of a person being just like a little computer in the bigger computer of the internet. But let me propose this. It's at least possible that what it means to be a human being is something we don't quite understand. We don't really know how the brain encodes information. We don't know how it works. We can't reproduce it. We don't really know where the sense of experience comes from. To say it's an illusion of a complex computer doesn't really say anything, because, well, as I was pointing out, experience is the one thing that isn't reduced if it's an illusion. Even an illusion of experience is still an experience, you know. Do you see that? Anyway, it gets to be a tricky area of thought. So if there might be something special about personhood, The thing about personhood is that in order to exercise it, there needs to be a little bit of a zone around it where you can get to know yourself, get to experiment with yourself in between engagements with the larger world. And if the device is cut so closely to you that feedback from them is being entered right into your immediate personal experience that guides you, that manipulates you, you are losing some free will. You're losing some freedom on a really fundamental level. If we were absolutely confident in the perfect omniscience, wisdom, and benevolence of the remote computers that do that, well, fine, I guess. But good luck with that. That's not the way it is. So, for one thing, because they can't represent reality anyway, they're too stupid, totally aside from their intent. And am I making sense now? Because I've just made a leap into philosophy that's a little harder to follow, I understand. Okay, good. So what happens is there's a weird trick that takes place when you make advertising become the only official business plan of network information services, which is kind of what's happened. The easiest way to see it, I think, is by considering language translation. So I should say I love the technology of language translation. I've been interested in it for a long time. It's fascinating. There's the Berkeley community is one of the centers of expertise in the world in it, and it's just interesting stuff. So the history of it is way back in the late 50s. A very lovely and generous mentor of mine named Marvin Minsky had once assigned, or so I don't know, this is the legend, but I heard it from him, so I think it's probably true. He assigned some graduate students a summer project of coming up with the perfect parser to translate between natural languages. Now, once again, this is one of those things that was honorable at the time. To us now, it seems ridiculous, but at the time, nobody knew. And remember, MIT in that time is also where Chomsky was, and Noam Chomsky had this idea of a compact, simple representation of the structure of language, right? So it was not, within the intellectual world of the time, it was a respectable idea. They came back unable to do it. And the problem of being able to process natural language remained stuck for many, many years. But then as the cost of computation came down, some folks at IBM Labs actually had this idea of just gathering a very large corpus, a very large body of examples of real natural language translation and performing correlations to create new translations. And suddenly they started getting performance. That was the breakthrough. So today, we're still basically doing that. There's some refinement to be done in the algorithms and all that, but it's still basically a problem that works on big data. So every night, algorithms at Google and Microsoft and IBM and maybe 3 or 4 other places in the world scour the entire web and a bunch of other sources for the very latest translations, because language is a mobile target. Language is a living thing, not a dead thing. They scour the whole world. They take in millions of documents from real people who've done translations. And then when you want to enter in a document to be translated, phrase by phrase, word by word, your document is matched up with instances that have already been translated by real people. And the result is a mashup or a pastiche of those correlations. And you know what? It's okay. It's not perfect, but it's good enough to get by in a lot of cases. So it's amazing. But there's a tricky thing that's happened here to the role of people. So let's consider the real human translators who are generating all those documents that are scraped every night. So I've been corresponding with the professional societies of translators around the world, and they've seen a precipitous drop in their own employment in the last few years since automated translation got good. It's reminiscent of what happened to journalists and musicians and photographers and so on. But the weird thing here is that just as with writers and musicians, it's not that nobody's interested in what they do. I mean, if nobody was interested in music, YouTube would just collapse, right? So it's not that people aren't interested in it. It's just that it's been mashed up their efforts have been mashed up in such a way that they're not the ones who benefit anymore. They've been disenfranchised, even though they're still needed. So there's this very strange situation where even though they're in a way being more utilized than ever, in a way they're more essential than ever, and in a way their efforts are reaching more people than ever, and yet somehow they're getting... And here there's a crucial distinction. On the one hand, you can complain that they're not getting paid as much, which is something to worry about. But the much more key idea, which is a little different, as I explained, is they're not having options for wealth anymore. When they do get paid, it's more and more piecemeal. It's more and more by the page or something. There aren't jobs. There aren't positions with security. There isn't wealth. There isn't any form of royalty. There isn't tenure. All those things are getting harder and harder to come by. So it's important to, both things are true. They're getting paid less, but even more importantly, they're being forced more and more into the informal economy, the economy of teaching assistants as opposed to tenure, let's say, in a campus context. So the tricky thing here is that we have a technology which I happen to think is great, really useful, a benefit to the world. We have this huge body of people who are essential to the function of that technology. The problem is not the algorithm. I don't think there's such a thing as an evil algorithm. The problem is not the computers. They're just Turing machines doing their thing. The problem isn't even the entrepreneurs, who are often decent people, really, in my experience. It's just that the ideology has disenfranchised these people who are still essential. That's where the screw-up is. It's a philosophical problem. And you have to ask, why? Why must it be this way? Because just as with Walmart, if you disenfranchise a big chunk of the population, it's one thing. Creative destruction is one thing. If you're saying, well, buggy whips are obsolete, so buggy whip makers are going to lose their jobs, that's fine as long as there's new jobs coming up. But if you say, and in this case there are new jobs, feeding these algorithms, being a contributor to a crucial corpus is a new job. But if you say it should be unpaid, not only do you destroy that population, you gradually destroy the whole economy. Here's another way to put it. On a macroeconomic level, if you insist on saying that a whole bunch of the activity in the economy is not going to be on the ledgers because it's part of the sharing economy, your ledgers won't record the economic growth that you should. And in a market economy, if you don't have economic growth, you have a zero-sum game or worse, then people turn on each other and it becomes cruel. So even if you're an Ayn Rand, fanatical libertarian, you have to admit that markets are kind when they're growing. And if they should be growing, but we artificially limit our accounting to create the illusion that they're not, that's got to be stupid. All right, does that make sense? All right, so the thing I want to point out here is that I can voice this complaint either in the language of the left or the language of the right. I just did that. In the left, the language is we're disenfranchising people who shouldn't be. In the language of the right is we're using bad accounting to pretend there isn't economic growth when there actually is. It doesn't matter which language you use. This problem transcends this stupid, tiresome old left-right debate. It's a different problem. Okay? Still following me? All right, great. So now, so here we run into this funny world of these Manichaean conflicts that people live by. So I find I'm often introduced as somebody who's turned against technology, when I hope it's absolutely clear that I haven't. So there's this sort of anti-technology people versus the pro-technology people. That's a phony debate that's not even worth having. In my opinion, the left versus right debate has also been made absolutely obsolete by big data. I hope I've demonstrated that. And I think the good news there is that there's a possibility of consilience that might be superior to the ones available before. But then, having said all that, we're still left with the question, well, what do you do about it? Where to from here? And I don't think there's any magic silver bullet here. I think this is a tough problem. In my last book, I've proposed one solution, which I'll describe to you, which a lot of people really like and a lot of people really, really hate. And I'm aware of 5 or 6 paths forward that have been proposed, and I'll mention some of the other ones too. But I don't think anyone really knows precisely what the best way is out of this dilemma. It's in a way a dilemma. It's a childish dilemma. It's very simply that if you happen to be able to get in a position close to one of the biggest computers, you get such amazing benefits and such an illusion of omniscience that you just can't believe it isn't so. And everybody who finds himself in that position repeats the mistake. Whether they're at a hedge fund or the NSA or an insurance company or a search company or a social network, they're all the same. And I call all those things, by the way, Siren Servers. Because Homer's sirens don't actually grab you and throw you on the rocks. It's you who lets yourself become a nutcase. So, anyway, my solution is actually, in a way, very retro. If you go back in the history of digital networks, the very first proposal for how to build a digital network is from 1960. Now, I should say, in terms of the history of descriptions of networks, there's a very rich history, more than most people realize. The potential for interesting communication networks was explored in fiction in the 19th century in a variety of ways. And the best example is probably, I think it's 1907, E.M. Forster's short story, The Machine Stops, which roughly describes our present world. It includes Facebook and Skype pretty well. And it's kind of interesting. You should look at it if you haven't. And then there's a famous 1940s piece by a guy named Vannevar Bush called Mimics, How We May Think. And the Mimics was a proposed device that would work on microfiche, but was sort of enhanced to include some of the features we think of as in digital networks. But the first proposal that actually used digital information as a basis with an understanding of it was from Ted Nelson at Harvard in 1960. And the interesting thing about it, he was the very first person on the scene, and sometimes the first person on the scene is able to have a clearer view than people who come later. And Ted's very first idea was precisely to address this economic problem, which is just incredible. And the reason why is that this economic problem has a long history. I mean, this question of whether new technologies throw people out of work or not was the original obsessive question that motivated Marx to think about an alternative approach to economics. It's been this huge thing for a long, long time, which I could go into. So there's a very long history of it. And what he was looking at is, hey, a digital network, which had never been conceived before, could be a way to address this thing in a new way. And so what he proposed, and remember, this is not somebody taking this idea of a digital network and then applying these ideas to it. This is the first expression of the idea of a digital network, just to be very clear about that. So his thought was, we could make a thing called a digital network where if somebody made use of somebody else's efforts in some way, there would be a link that would keep track of that. And then when they made any money from what they did, there would be an automatic royalty that would pay back. Instead of the present system of all or nothing benefits, where you either get tenure or you don't, you either win the copyright or you don't, you get the patent or you don't, you get the tax medallion or you don't. Instead of that world of very crude total cutoffs, there'd be this gradual world where people would automatically, as a matter of course, be able to use anything. It would be a radically open world, and yet it would be a radically compensated world too. It was a really interesting idea. Ted is still with us. He lives on a houseboat in Sausalito. He's getting honored at Chapman College in a couple of months with a special Lifetime Achievement Award where I'm going to go down to speak down in LA, or Orange County actually. And it's an amazing thing. Now, the problem was that Ted is the quintessential countercultural person. Like, I look countercultural because of my hair, but Ted's really countercultural, and he's just really a hippie beatnik, and instead of just getting a bunch of programmers together to build this, they had to be some sort of collective, and they had to, I don't know, it just got burdened by the cultural excesses of the time. Oh, am I over time or something?
Well, I'm just curious, would you be willing to take a few questions?
Well, give me a sense of where I'm at in the time.
Well, we're at 11:30.
Oh my God, is that when I'm supposed to stop? Yeah. All right, I'll wrap this up in 2 sentences. I'll wrap this up in 2 sentences, and then I'll take questions if people want to stay. Sorry about that. I don't. For the first 10 years of thinking about networks through the 60s, this was considered what a digital network would be. And then during the 70s and 80s and 90s, gradually it lost those qualities piece by piece. Very particular technical qualities like whether links are two-way or one-way, that sort of thing, until by the time the web was born and then the modern digital economy, all of those economic ideas had totally been divorced so that the only, from the design of networks, so the only beneficiaries were the people who owned the biggest computers. Getting it right the first time would have been a lot better than trying to claw our way back to getting it right, but I don't think we have any other choice. So there's 2 sentences, long, but then, all right, so that's the talk. Questions? Oh, yeah. You were first. Oh, feel free to go if you have to. Don't, yeah.
So my question is, you mentioned this group of elite who you say are some of the best that we've ever had, probably in human history.
Maybe not the best, but the nicest.
The nicest.
Like, yeah.
So I guess sort of my question is, it's not so much how nice they are. It's something that you touched on during your talk, which is that just the fact that they are elite and that they are in this system and that there's sort of a prevailing ideology for the system makes it very difficult to get things like this distributed compensation mechanism up and running or anything like that. So I'm interested in your thoughts on not only like the sort of technology behind that, but like how we can organize a political and social movement to get that done. And I guess in a sense, sort of that aspect of this and how we can work together with the elite, because the worst thing that could happen is working against them, in your opinion.
Well, okay, so in my view, there's some successes in history that are worth considering as precedents for how to improve the situation. And in particular, I'm really interested in the postwar period in the 20th century. We had decades of stability and a growing middle class and general betterment in the developed world. Pacific Rim, Asia, North America, Europe anyway. Really kind of amazing. So how did that happen? And in my view, there was a confluence of 2 things that made it happen. One was the labor movement, which was a sort of a softened version of leftism that just argued that within a market system, labor should be able to coordinate their negotiations instead of being forced to negotiate as singletons. The other one, though, is a little less well known and really needs to be known, which is that the major industrialists of the late 19th century and early 20th century had come to a realization that if they didn't make their customers rich, they couldn't become as rich as they wanted to be. So the most famous example, which is hauled out often, but I think it should be, is Henry Ford. And I think what makes the example so powerful is that he was such a bastard. We have a genuinely uncharitable racist creep. So there's absolutely no sense of this guy having any goodwill towards anybody. And if you think I'm talking about him meanly, you should hear his own descendants talk about him. He was just a bad guy. He was kind of a fascist. But the thing is, he was a greedy fascist. And what he did is he insisted that his own factory workers be paid enough that it would force his other industrialists to pay their factory workers more so that they'd be able to afford cars. And so there's this interesting, unintentional cooperation between labor and management, which nobody would want to admit to, but it did happen, because without that, you can't have economic growth. And exactly the same argument applies. If you're running one of the big Siren Servers now, you can either extract wealth from a stagnant economy, or you can grow an economy and grow with it. Which choice gives you more? So, it's a little complex, but overall, you're better off supporting a strong economy. And this is also, by the way, why we should support an equitably... I'm a 1%er, I guess, weirdly enough, at this point in my life. And yet I realize the society I live in is infinitely more important than personal wealth to one's experience. So at some point, enlightened self-interest is precisely the motivator. So if it can get through to a creep like Henry Ford, it ought to be able to get through to the very decent overlords of Silicon Valley and Wall Street. That's not to say it'll happen instantly, but I think there's a lot of hope for it because it happened before. No, so you. Well, I want to get to Carlo, but I want to do it in the order. Oh, okay. Carlo, and then you'll do. All right.
First of all, Jaron, thank you very much for a whole bunch of insightful, ideas and all these cross-links between different fields. That's just wonderful.
Oh, thanks.
Now, you mentioned that we have this inequality in distribution and wealth, and some people on the top, and they're actually probably good people and well-meaning and all of that. But I think, in a way, they're paired now with other entities, and they're called corporations. And they seem to be another entity that's also at the top, and it seems much harder to control these entities because they have their own logic. And we could, for instance, say, why don't we tax corporations like individuals on a very progressive rate in order to control growth? But I think these corporations would not, in their self-interest, allow this to happen. Right? So can we hope that maybe the few well-meaning individuals are strong enough to stand up against these other partners at the top?
Well, the thing to understand is that the Siren Server regime is superior to the corporate regime at this point. Siren Servers tend to be so tightly held that the only major one where there's corporate governance is Microsoft. All the others are so tightly held that if the status of corporations changed through a move like that, they would privatize. So you have to understand that this system is far more powerful than the existing power structure of the idea of the corporation. It just supersedes it, so it would just be jettisoned in a second. We've already seen that happen in the financial services industry where it was able to jettison all the structures that were constraining it. The power concentration of having a top information server, I didn't even get into the influence on elections, and there's a lot of stuff I didn't get to, but the amount of power concentration is such that traditional structures aren't that relevant to it.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you about access and wealth, and bring in the case of your musicians and the case of your translators. And I see two different things happening here, and how they're related. I'd like to ask you about. One is access. Consumer access has brought the disappearance of musicians, say of opera, because consumers, instead of going to the local opera, will go online and get the big stars who accumulate wealth, and all the others disappear.
By real data, that's actually not true, but go on.
Whereas
it's a very interesting question. But
with the disappearance of translators, we don't have a consumer access to the network, but we have a production access to the network. In other words, the reason translators are disappearing here is because India's producing them. Translations being done in India rather than here. So our local translators are disappearing. So there's access, consumer access, and production access, which seem to be redistributing wealth in different ways, the one to the top and the other more to the masses. They're just in a different country, but they're the masses. They're even more masses than we are.
Okay,
any ideas
so there's a lot to say there. One thing, I'm realizing there's a huge branch of my argument I just didn't have time to make, which is that what's happened with the pure information industries now, like translators and musicians, will happen to transportation, manufacturing, healthcare, everything else, energy, waste management. All those things will get roboticized or made hyper-efficient through information systems, so that this is the prototype for the whole of the economy. That's a crucial thing to understand. Because if you're only talking about what's sometimes called the creative classes, that would be a small part of the economy, and it might sound a little whiny to be too worried about it as a member of it, but in fact, it's everything. That's a crucial thing. But then, all right, so this gets in, there's a bit of network math here, which is really fascinating, which is absolutely crucial to answering your question. Let's first talk about the example of musicians. You talk about people going for the most famous. Well, here's something really amazing. If there are broadly speaking, there are two prominent network structures that bring people in contact with music these days. One is what we call a hub and spokes model, which would be like iTunes, where you have a central authority and everything connects through it. If you look at what people are exposed to on that, it tends to be Zipfian. You tend to have a power law or long tail with everybody going to the top thing, so the Beyonce download or something like that. But if you have a thickly connected network, where people communicate with each other and there's not really a central authority. And there are a lot of examples of that. One would be a Facebook-like system, social networking. But the massive collaborative systems like Linux or Wikipedia are another example, even though Wikipedia is more centralized than people like to admit. But they're more thickly connected anyway. Then the distribution of information that an average person is exposed to, has a middle-class hump to it. Like that, instead of the zip curve, you get a strong middle. And so it actually shifts. So in fact, in a thickly connected network, you don't tend to see this concentration. That's a crucial empirical result, which surprised me, but it's been replicated many times now. So that's interesting, and to me it's a sign of hope. It means that if that were monetized, we'd get a middle class out of it. And a middle class is the only way to have a non-corrupt democracy. So that's a whole chain of thoughts I didn't get into. All right, and then as far as production versus just consumer versus sourcing, all right, this is another whole interesting story. So I can borrow an idea from early Marx, if I may, while repudiating Marx utterly, who Marx and Henry Ford are kind of the same. They're people whose ideas played out really badly in some ways, but they had some good. Marx is nicer than Henry Ford, but I still think his ideas played out just dismally. Anyway, Marx didn't view globalization as distinct from optimization or obsolescence. He viewed them all as part of the same process, and I do too. So if a network can optimize where the work is done and can offshore something effectively, that's just part of the same overall ability of a central computational ability to optimize other people to its advantage. Now, it has to be said that the way this progresses always is that initially you move it to wherever the cheapest people are, and then you even automate them away. So we move Walmart optimizes the world to move manufacturing to China, and then robots will bankrupt China suddenly. It's true that there are some services that have moved translation to India, but then automated translation will bankrupt those very quickly. So it's the same process over and over again, and it'll apply to every sector of the economy. It should be viewed not as two different ideas in opposition, but as part of the same process.
One final question.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Matt, and I've lived a lot in Europe, and the housing is a lot more egalitarian there. Now, Google is being hated now because of the Google buses, because of all the evictions in San Francisco.
Yeah.
Don't the founders care about their legacy? I mean, they could get a 100-year loan at 0% interest for $100 billion, buy apartment buildings, let all those working stiffs stay there with their families, instead of kicking people out in the street. I know they're not stupid, but don't they care about how they're viewed?
This is a tough issue. Were any of you here when I debated Peter Norvig with Neil Stevenson on campus a while ago? So if you remember Peter, who's great, Peter's great, right? He's a great guy. But, we were talking about this stuff, and he was saying, well, maybe what should happen is we should just be, the people who are left behind by digital optimizations or automations, we should just start paying them, just a stipend to be alive. And that's an idea that's gaining some currency around the world. There's a move to do it in Switzerland, for instance. If you look at among the Silicon Valley sort of elites, there's a tremendous sense of guilt for the damage we've done to journalism. In private discussions, a lot of people will say, wow, these horrible wars in the Middle East during the Bush years in Afghanistan and Iraq. Maybe Afghanistan had to happen, but Iraq didn't. Like, what a stupid thing. And maybe if we'd had a stronger press, it would have helped. But we had just destroyed it. And so now what you're seeing is Silicon Valley elite people propping up the press. So basically, gradually Silicon Valley is paying for our journalism. You have, the New York Times is a funny case, but a guy who runs a cell phone network, which I view as a Siren server of a certain kind, owns the New York Times, and then the guy from Amazon just bought the Washington Post, and on and on. There are all these things. So it's being propped up. And as the cable companies eventually fall, those will also be propped up. But, can we do it for the whole society? And here you run into this issue that patronage, like having Borgias be your landlord, like no matter how good they are at first, their kids will probably be not as good. Like, I don't think it's a good setup for a society. So, I understand the impulse to say they're so rich, why don't they just fix it? But the problem with it is that would concentrate it would enshrine a kind of power that they shouldn't have. And so I understand the impulse And by the way, they do care, from the ones I know. Not all of them. I mean, look, let's just be really honest. There's some... Larry Ellison cares less than somebody like Sergey. I mean, like, there are variations in their personalities. But, most of them are good. Most of them are decent people. And from their point of view, it's like, well, we did the bus thing out of this kind of... We were just trying to, reduce global climate change and emissions and congestion. We're trying to do this good thing. Why do people not like our buses? Like, so from their perspective, they're trying to do the right thing. And... It's a tough one. I mean, there was this event that happened a while ago where some of the protesters of one of the buses near the Ashby BART station followed a Google guy home and surrounded his house when he was in there with his kid. And I'm like, that's just crazy. Guys, come on. Like, it's always possible to make enemies of each other, but it's way premature here. Like, we should try... So I mentioned there are other solutions. The one I just described one path that I'm interested in. There's some other ideas, but... I think asking them to fix the problem with their money is not the right long-term thing. It just will enshrine a superclass. I don't think it's the right idea. But I mean, I understand where it's coming from, though. All right. Hey, thanks.